Alright, see if I can get this to work. It's my first attempt at using screenshots. I think I know what I'm dealing with it. Alright, so this is Chapter 1, Notes for Anatomy and Physiology. So first, we get into the question of what is anatomy and physiology. So this is a thought question, and for your first question on your video note sheets, I would like you to write down, what do you think anatomy and physiology means? So pause the video here, just take a moment, your first initial impressions. Okay, so hopefully you wrote down the answer to question 1. So I'll give you the definitions of what anatomy and physiology mean in just a moment. But they are always taught together. They're always taught together for the very simple reason that anatomy is basically the parts of the body, and the physiology is how they work together. So if you were to be a mechanic, for example, and you're learning to be a mechanic, and you just learned all the parts of the car, air filter, oil filter, tires, and never learned how they work together, you would not be a very efficient mechanic. So for you to be an efficient physiologist, you need to learn both the parts and then the function. And physiology is the function. Your book also mentions a couple of things about microscopic and gross anatomy. Now, I'm not going to get too much detail with that. You know what microscopic means. The word gross, well, maybe you think anatomy is kind of gross. Maybe you don't. But gross means like the whole thing. And a good analogy for remembering that word is with paychecks, which is very easy for us to remember because we like money. But your net pay is the pay you actually cash out or put into your bank account after the taxes and other deductions have been taken out. Your gross pay is before that. That's the easy way to remember it. So microscopic versus gross anatomy basically means gross anatomy is the whole thing. Microscopic is just looking at a very small piece of it. Gross anatomy also kind of refers to macroscopic, which means larger than microscopic. And your book gets into regional versus surface versus systemic anatomy. So I'm not going to get into this too much. Surface and regional refers to the outside or certain areas. There's names for the outside of the body. Regional is names for certain regions. And systemic is what we focus on a lot with the organ systems. So here's the definition. So anatomy is the actual study of the structure and shape. Physiology, the study how the body and parts actually function. And the level of organization, which you can see here, you kind of already know this, but it's helpful to go over again. You know, we are all basically atoms arranged together. And if you've taken any physics, you know that there are much smaller particles that make up those atoms. This goes way beyond the scope of what we're talking about. And these atoms are arranged into molecules to make cells, and then cells are organized into tissues. So basically a tissue is groups of cells working together. Those tissues, when they work together for a certain function or functions, they are called organs. An organ system are organs together, working together. An organism is the totality of the entire organism itself, or everything inside the organism. So pretty simple stuff, but it's just helpful to go over it. It's more important, I think, to get to conceptually think of tissues as being cells working together, and then organs are tissues working together. And therefore organs are also tissues and cells working together. The atoms, you know, they don't really work together. They follow rules of physics and chemistry. But the cells actually use those atoms to communicate with each other and to actually work together. So like I was saying in class, at least I think I was saying in class, that, you know, cells are pretty unique where they work together, they can fix themselves, they make more of themselves. Pretty special entities. Okay, so thought question number 4. So in your notes video questions, so this is name any 5 basic, typo, any basic human survival needs. So pause the video here, and this is question 4. Alright, so most likely, if you had paused it and come back, you had wrote down some basic survival needs like water and food and shelter, maybe love or companionship. But really, survival needs, as far as anatomy goes, are some of those things. So the big ones, there are 5 of them, are nutrients, which you probably said is food, oxygen, pretty obvious, water, very, very obvious. You can only live, it depends on the person, how big you are, where you are, but generally 3 or 4 days without taking in any more water. Food, you can last a while. Again, it depends on how big you are. But water is the big one. Every time you breathe, you're losing water. Every time you talk, you're losing water. And you constantly are using water to flush out waste through the urinary system. Body temperature. So you got a strict maintenance within upper and lower limits of body temperature. You get below 90 degrees, you're hypothermic. Feels pretty warm, right? But that is too cold for your body's enzymes to function properly. And then if your body gets too warm, you start to approach 105, 106. The body's enzymes that are necessary for cell function start to unravel or denature. So body temperature is very important. And then the one that nobody ever thinks of is atmospheric pressure. This comes into play when we learn about the respiratory system. The respiratory system requires pressure on the outside of the body to help push that air inside of your lungs. Therefore, you can get the oxygen. If you were to go to another planet that had half of the air pressure that we have, I believe, if I remember correctly, we got about 15 pounds per square inch of air pressure on us at sea level. So if you went someplace where there was only 8, and you went to that place, and there was just the same amount of oxygen as it was on Earth, but you would go to open your mouth and try to breathe in, you would get half the amount of air being pushed into your lungs, because we were designed for 15 pounds a square inch. And half the oxygen would be bad. It wouldn't last very long. So that becomes a little bit more apparent when we do the respiratory system. Here are some necessary life functions. Now, survival need, life function. Survival need, life function. How do we distinguish between these two? Life function is basically like something you need like right now. Immediately. Constantly. And these are functions. Function means a verb, right? These are things that other things do. And life does. Human body does. So some of them are pretty obvious, like movement, respond to stimuli, digestion. Maintaining boundaries just basically means, you have an inside and outside. Excretion, getting rid of waste, reproduction, growth, and obviously metabolism. Metabolism, most people think they know what metabolism means when it comes to anatomy. They think like burning calories. It is that, but it's the sum of all chemical reactions in a cell or body that are not, even ones that are not directly related to burning calories. Then obviously we have to grow and maintain the cells that we have. Cells are always dying and being replaced, even as you get older. And you stop growing like you did when you were younger. So here's the language of anatomy. So this is most of those words that are on page, whatever that is there. This is not all of them, though. Now, these are the ones that I feel the most important for a high school anatomy class. There's quite a few more words out there that some of them are listed in your book. I'm trying to find a page right now, but they're in there somewhere. That, if somebody is going to, on page 19, if somebody's going to go to school to be a doctor or a nurse, you'll learn even more of those. These are the ones that we pretty much use. Superior, inferior, anterior, and posterior. And there's also ventral and dorsal, which come up every once in a while. They essentially mean the same thing. Superficial, deep, proximal and distal, medial, and lateral. They come in pairs. So it all depends on where they are on the body. We'll do an activity with this in class. The one that is not so obvious sometimes is proximal and distal. So the trunk of the body is basically not your arms, not your legs, and not your head. So the thickest part of the body. So if you were to stick out your arm or your leg, which would be more proximal if you were sticking out your leg? Would it be your ankle or your knee? Closer to the trunk of the body would be your knee. So you'd say your knee is more proximal than your ankle. Distal would mean it's more distance, has more distance, it's farther away from the trunk of the body. The other ones are kind of obvious. They're just kind of opposites of each other. What's not obvious is learning the words themselves, so that might take a little bit of time. So here's the surface anatomy. I don't want to get into this. A lot of these words we don't really use in this class. Some of them you do, some of them you hear in real life. Like gluteal, it's the butt. That's your glutes, lumbar. Sometimes you hear that about back problems. Some of them, if some people work out, deltoids. The deltoid region is basically the shoulder region. But I'm not going to get into these. Just don't use them that much. But you can see the words down here, anterior ventral, posterior dorsal. These words come up a lot. We do need to know those. Alright, thought question number 10 from your video notes questions. The next part about the chapter is getting into homeostasis. Homeostasis basically means same status or same state in Latin. So a lot of these words in anatomy, just looking at the Latin portion of that sentence. The first anatomists were the Greeks and Romans. They were the first culture that did not completely demonize touching the human body after death. So they had a different and open society. I mean, obviously we had mummification, but that was more for religious purposes. With the advent of the beginnings of scientific thinking, people started to explore the body. And how they acquire these bodies is sometimes scandalous. Maybe they dug them up, maybe they stole bodies, maybe they were given bodies. But the early anatomists, some kind of creepy people, I'm guessing. But they were trying to go about it scientifically, and they were really trying to explore what was going on in the body. They weren't just like cutting things open and looking at it. Those are serial killers. But they were trying to learn things. So a lot of our words come from way back, thousands of years ago, have their origins in Latin and Greek because of that region. And a lot of things are named after shapes too, from what they actually saw. And they named them after that. So the thought question here says, the human body's goal is to remain in control of what's going on inside at all times. What is the one thing that the body likes to keep in the same state? What is one thing, not the one thing, many things. Same state inside the body. So I'll pause the video here and think about that for a moment and write your answer down. Okay. Hopefully you started back up and you wrote something down. You might have said something like temperature, blood sugar, oxygen levels. Many different things that the body likes to keep in control or at the same level throughout the day. We'll talk more about that in class. So the definition of homeostasis really is health. If you're not in a state of homeostasis, you are in a state of being out of balance, and if that balance is severe or happens in an organ, it could result in disease or medical condition. So homeostasis is the ability to maintain a stable internal environment even when the outside world is continuously changing. The outside world is the environment. Cell phone. So 3 steps to homeostatic regulation. So homeostatic just refers to homeostasis. Regulation refers to control, regulating. So you always have a receptor. You got to have some sort of biological sensor that monitors and responds to changes in the environment. And it could be the inner environment, or it could be the outer environment. It can go either way. You have receptors for both. You have to have some sort of control center that takes that information and processes it. So this is basically going to be the brain. And then it's going to try to make a response to that. And the response is the effector, or the effect. So it's the means for the response to oppose or reinforce the stimulus. And the stimulus goes back to what the biological sensor is being stimulated by. That's where they get that word from. So it's going to do something about it. So the effector is the feedback. And the word feedback we say over and over again is something called positive feedback and negative feedback. The effector is what the feedback is. The effector is what's going to happen. The effector is what needs to be done, or is going to be done. So the next slide here, we got positive feedback and negative feedback. So these are basically the effects. So positive feedback reinforces the stimulus, makes it go faster. An analogy turns up the volume, or hits the throttle, puts the foot on the gas, and if you're driving a car. It makes it go faster. Negative feedback counteracts the stimulus to keep it within predefined limits, or it slows it down. In the analogy is it hits the brakes. It says stop. Predefined limits, it's basically in your genetics. So your genes determine predefined limits of many different things, like oxygen levels or sugar levels. The majority of homeostatic control in the body uses negative feedback. So the body likes to have some limits of how high or how low oxygen levels can be, how high or low sugar levels can be. But positive feedback is used in the body, and sometimes it's used within negative feedback. So both can be used at the same time. But for the most part, negative feedback is what the body uses. So I'm going to get some pictures of some examples, so there's a lot going on here. So you might want to take a moment to pause it and look at the picture, if you can't listen and read at the same time. So we have some examples of negative feedback outside the body. So very simple. In a room, you have a thermostat, which is like the brain. You have a receptor, which is a thermometer, and oftentimes they're put into the same unit. So the receptor figures out what temperature it is. Inside the control center, there are some limits. If it gets too high or too low, then it can do something about it. So if it's summertime, it gets too high, the control center will sense the temperature is going beyond what you set it for. The effector is the air conditioner turns on. Normal room temperature is maintained. Thermometer sees that the temperature has gone down. I should say sees the temperature has gone down. Control center sees that the thermometer has gone down, and then the effector will be shut off. This is negative feedback. This is putting on the brakes. This is slowing something down. And that something is the room temperature in response to the environment, what's going on outside the room. Sometimes inside the room too. It's a good analogy because sometimes your body makes a lot of heat within inside itself, like if you were running, and also deals with heat or cold outside the body. So it's kind of the same thing, but using some information and pictures with the body. So you have control mechanisms for when body temperature rises, control mechanism when body temperature falls. So it goes either way. So you have receptors up here and over here that are sensing the body's temperature, and then they're in the hypothalamus of the brain. That's why you're getting these pictures of the brain here. So body temperature, averages 99. Everybody has a different body temperature. Mine's generally in the high 97s, so whenever I take my temperature, some people could be higher. So the response that the brain has for these temperature changes are varied, and they're not all listed here. One of the effectors it has for body temperature rises is blood vessels and sweat glands in the skin are affected. So blood vessels will basically dilate near the skin. And we know that water holds a lot of heat, and there's a lot of water in your blood. It kind of makes sense that put water near the surface of your body, and more likely it's going to dissipate into the environment around you. And obviously sweating is going to help you cool down. There's also something on here, I don't believe it says it on here anymore too, but your metabolism will go down a little bit. Your body will make less of something called thyroxine, which is your metabolism hormone. And it'll do the opposite, if body temperature falls. If it's too cold, blood vessels will constrict, sweat glands will stop working, you may shiver. Shivering is your muscles moving back and forth really quickly, so muscles are the main furnace in your body for making heat. And you may also increase your metabolism here. You burn more calories in the winter just by, walking to the car outside than you do in the summertime. It's just simply colder. And it's generally a little bit colder where you live, too. So this is negative feedback. You have effectors that will put the brakes on something going beyond the lower or upper limits, predefined limits by the body, which is determined by your genetics. Here's another example with blood sugar. So over here is your pancreas, is your liver, and here's some cells. So one of the things your pancreas does is make insulin. And insulin tells your cells to basically take in glucose. So if your blood sugar goes really, really high, like you just had lunch, for example, your pancreas will sense that, and it will secrete insulin. Insulin will go to your cells. It'll tell your cells to open up certain channels in its cell membrane to absorb glucose. Glucose will go down. It also tells the liver to take up glucose out of the blood and store it as something called glycogen. And it'll do that until you get to this level right here, normal glucose level, 90 milligrams per 100 mLs of blood. And it does the same thing too with low blood sugar. It'll make less insulin. Alright? And what will happen when you have less insulin, you have another hormone called glucagon that basically tells the liver to release some glucose into the blood. And it'll tell the cells to stop absorbing glucose from the blood also. It's another example of negative feedback. Putting the brakes on blood going too low, putting the brakes on blood sugar going too high. And it's just a picture of the pancreas. So you have some cells called beta cells that make the insulin. So pancreas is pretty important organ. There's a picture of inside the cells. A lot of weird stuff going on here. So here's the cell membrane. And then, if you remember from biology, these are protein doors. So sometimes we call them receptors, sometimes we call them doors. It all depends on their structure. Sometimes receptors can open, sometimes they don't. But basically what happens is insulin comes in the area of a cell, and this is the little yellow thing here, and they'll attach themselves chemically to these receptors, and these receptors are only receptive to insulin. Nothing else will bind with them. And what happens is a chemical signal will be released. See that little red part there? This is basically telling you it's active. And what will happen is chemical will be released, and it'll go into the nucleus, and there'll be some gene expression, but also what will happen is you have a secondary messenger molecule that will come over here, and you have a GLUT4 door, so to speak. So this is the GLUT is just it's a chemical name. That's why they abbreviate it. But basically it's a door that allows glucose to go in and out. So this secondary molecule will stick onto here, and it'll allow the door to open and allow glucose in. So there'll be many, many of these. There'll be thousands and thousands and thousands of these on each cell. And then you have trillions of cells, so you can get a lot of glucose out of the blood very quickly. Oops. And then glucose will be used to do all the things that the cell uses. So without that insulin, this door doesn't open. This door will stay closed. And glucagon can also have an effect where the door closes. So all negative feedback. Example of positive feedback. So here, this is a sequence of what happens when a blood vessel breaks, one of the many things. Breaking blood vessel causes bleeding, damaged cells release chemicals. That will start the clotting process. So this is basically a negative feedback process, but within that negative feedback process, you have this process going on here where there are some chemicals released that accelerates clotting. But the clotting chemicals, or the clotting process, I should say, causes more chemicals to be released. So inside the negative feedback process, you have a positive feedback process, which speeds up. The visual representation will be here. So, blood vessel gets damaged, the cells release a chemical that encourages platelets, which are floating around in your blood, to stick to it. And the platelets, I should say the damaged portion of it, release chemicals, but the platelets also release chemicals that attract more platelets. So you have this attraction going on. What stops this positive feedback is when the cells become repaired. And once they become repaired, then this positive feedback will stop. But this is a good thing because the platelets attract more platelets. It basically means that the blood clot will clot that much faster, since they weren't attracted to that. So that's helpful. But like I said, negative feedback is the main mechanism that the body uses. And lastly, your book talks about body cavities. I'm not going to get into the names of body cavities too much. We just got to know they're there. So they are cavities. You normally think of as when you go to the dentist and you get a little hole with depression in your tooth. Well, a cavity is basically a hole. So Your body cavities are internal chambers or cavities inside the body. They're lubricated by a mucus-like substance. Mucus-like substances. Mucus is basically, we normally think it was kind of nasty and associated with sickness, but mucus has particular proteins in it mixed with water and some other substances, sometimes antimicrobial, that allow materials to slide past one another in the body without friction. This is very helpful. I mean, just think of all your joints. You have fluid inside. It's called synovial fluid that is extremely slippery. That if you didn't have it there, your joints, your cartilage would wear away very quickly, faster than your body could repair it. So there's fluids in these cavities. There's also some gases, but there is some open space in there. And gases would be water vapor and CO2 that are naturally diffusing out of your body tissues. But for the most part, it's an open space to allow for expansion of certain kinds of organs like your lungs, your kidneys. But they're also to protect delicate organs from accidental shocks, cushion them from everyday movements like walking, jumping, and running. So, I mean, your body is very squishy, and it has to be that way for protection, but also to be able to expand. I mean, think about if you had a big meal. If you didn't have some cavities in your abdomen, you know, all that food that you would eat at like Thanksgiving would go into your body, and it's potential that it could squish and push upon a vital blood vessel, leading to the bottom half of your body that could cut off blood flow. But since your body's squishy and you have these cavities, they allow some expansion, and pretty much you don't have too much problems with that. I think that is all. Yeah, pretty much. You got a couple pictures here of the cavities. I think that will do it.